All right. You're in luck, Amber. Only one more to go. Only one more. Hey, I don't want to push you into telling any lies, Amber. We'll just stop. Okay, we are here at chapter 13. Chapter 13. The passage that we all love so much. We're going to talk about paying taxes here in a minute. We love that. In fact, I was talking about paying taxes with Bill here earlier. He tried to get me to pay his taxes, and I was trying to get him to pay mine, and we just came to a standoff. Ain't neither one of us going to pay our taxes, I don't guess. All right, chapter 13, first 7 verses talks about the civil authorities. And the passage begins with the word let. It's an imperative. Okay, it's a commandment. So right off the bat, Paul is telling the brethren here something that is something that has to be done. He's talking to the souls here. Obviously, that refers to people. The word soul is a generic term. It could be the spirit of man. It can be a person. You can be a dead soul or a living soul. And so he's talking to the people here. And the people are to be in subjection to the higher powers. Well, what higher powers are we talking about? Well, if we add into this here, verse 4, the higher powers wield the sword. Well, the church higher powers don't wield the sword. The elders don't wield the sword. So obviously we're talking about civil authorities. Okay? And we can cross-reference that with 2 Corinthians 10, 4 through 5. Peter gave a similar directive regarding civil authority, 2 Peter 2, 13 through 17. And so when we're talking about the government, God ordained the government. He gave government their authority. In fact, God has ordained 3 institutions. The first institution He ordained is the oldest institution, the home. We go all the way back to Genesis chapter 2. He created Adam. He caused a deep sleep to fall upon Adam. Now, as you look at that narrative, He created Adam, and then in the process of Adam fulfilling the work requirements that God had placed on him, and by the way, work was not part of the punishment that was placed upon Adam. Adam always had to work. The woman, no. I'm not going to tell your wife you said that, Bill. Adam always had to work. That was part of the deal. Dress and keep the garden. The harder work was part of the punishment, right? He had to compete with the thorns and the thistles and the weeds and things like that after he had sinned. But in the process of fulfilling that work, Adam was there all by himself. And he was naming those animals. You recall that. They were coming up to him, and because he was a smart individual, God had given him a mind, and he could think of all those names, and he put on those animals. And as he was doing that, guess what he determined? He didn't have someone that was like him. He didn't have a helpmeet. And so God caused a deep sleep to fall upon Adam. He removed a rib from him, and He created the woman. And that was the first family, God's oldest institution. And the home provides a much needed resource for society. It provides good citizens. That's the idea, isn't it? That's the goal, to provide good citizens. You learn how to be a good citizen in the home. You learn how to abide by authority. You learn to follow the rules. You learn to be a good person. The father and the husband, they are the primary authority in the home. Then you have the church. That's God's spiritual institution. Okay? It's designed to advance God's work on earth. It's designed to convert the lost. It's designed to help those who are in need. It's designed to edify God's people. Okay? That's the purpose of the church. Who's the head of the church? Well, Christ is the head of the church. That's testified to in the New Testament. Now, on the local level, God has also designed a government within the church, a leadership, you might say. He has provided for there to be elders. There is no earthly headquarters for the church, only at the local congregation. Each congregation ordains elders. The elders are where they worship. You have Brother Bill, elder at over here at East Ridge. Okay? He's not an elder here at Greens Lake Road. You have Josh and Reggie, two of our elders here. They're not elders over at East Ridge. Now, can we cooperate amongst congregations? Well, sure we can do that. But elders are elders where they are members. I heard Brother James Rogers say one time one of the greatest statements I ever heard regarding elders. Elders are shepherds. That's one of the designations. Shepherds are supposed to smell like the sheep, aren't they? Is that what shepherds are? They oversee the flock. Shepherds are supposed to smell like the sheep. You can't do that if you're trying to oversee a flock across town. That's why we don't have a earthly headquarters. Okay, and that's the oldest institution. Then, of course, you have civil government appointed by God. Their authority is divided according to the type of rule decided on by who? Whoever's in charge, whoever's in power, whoever happens to have taken over, right? Now, that doesn't mean God has endorsed that particular form of government. He certainly does not endorse an oppressive government. But He'll allow them to be in charge until it comes time to punish them. And He'll do that too. He'll do that too. Okay? Hitler was in charge of Germany for a good little while, wasn't he? Until he wasn't anymore. Mussolini was in charge of Italy until he wasn't anymore. And God punished him. Okay? So, whoever's in charge, whoever has taken over, whoever has taken authority is the civil government. Now, are we to be in subjection to that civil authority? The answer is yes, as long as it doesn't violate God's laws. Now, can you flee? 100%. You can get away. That's the right answer every time if you need to, because it's what Paul did. Paul fled. Paul fled. Okay? Now, those who are in power sometimes get overthrown. Sometimes they get overthrown. Okay? Our nation's history is one of getting overthrown. Okay? And so whoever's in power puts up the government. A democratic form of government is better for the people, but you can be a Christian under any form of government. Okay? As long as it does not interfere with God's directives, you are to follow that form of government. And in this passage, verse 3, Paul gives the general rule about civil rulers. In normal circumstances, okay, they don't present a problem or a danger to citizens. Normal circumstances, okay? They enact laws to keep peace. In normal circumstances, the civil government didn't present a danger to Paul. In normal circumstances. In fact, on occasion, the civil government saved Paul's life. Okay? Now, ultimately, they did present a danger to Paul because he lost his life at the hands of the government. Okay? But I don't know that, and probably if it had just been the Roman government without the Jewish agitators, probably Paul wouldn't have lost his life. Okay? But anyway, Paul makes the statement here that only those who violate the law have any fear of the law. Okay? Law-abiding citizens have no reason to fear civil law. In fact, if they're law-abiding, the civil government might even give them a commendation. All right? The subject of the first part of verse 4 is the civil ruler. And when he operates within his realm, he is a minister or a servant of God. That's what Paul says. Now, what Paul's not talking about here is he's not addressing the spiritual condition of this minister or servant of God. He is just talking about his actions within that ordained office of civil ruling. Okay? Because God has set up civil government. I'm not talking about whether he's a Christian. Okay? He's talking about him doing a good job. And if he does the way God would have him to do, he's a benefit to both the Christian and the non-Christian. And at the same time, if he's doing what God wants him to do, he is a terror to the Christian or the non-Christian who violates civil law. There is a need in society to have direction over it. Society needs to be directed. Okay? And we also see in verse 4 that God has ordained civil government to be able to execute capital punishment. If a person violates a law that has been deemed a capital crime, the government does not wield the sword or have access to means of death just for show. Okay? They have the means to put you to death because God has said that's appropriate. For instance, if you murder someone, the state has every right to take your life because that's not murder, that's just simply killing someone. Is it wrong to kill someone? Well, it depends on the context, doesn't it? If you illegally or unrighteously take someone's life, that's called murder. The life of an innocent, right? If you righteously take someone's life, that's called killing them. And you've killed them because the state deemed it worthy. They deemed they were worthy of death. And by the way, who's killed more people in the world than anyone else? God. God has. No one has killed more people than God. In one instance, he killed the whole world in the flood, didn't he? Except for 8 people. Yeah. And that was a righteous killing, wasn't it? God never murdered anybody. Thou shalt not commit murder. That's, thou shalt do no killing. Or thou shalt not kill. Thou shalt not commit murder. That's what the translation ought to be. That's the proper meaning of that word. So God says it's okay to righteously take someone's life if they have killed an innocent person. Now, it's up to the civil government to declare what's capital crime and what's not. According to, now, just because they say something's a capital crime doesn't mean it is. It's all based in God's law, right? All based in God's law. Now, he also gives 2 reasons here why we're to be obedient to civil law. The first one is you don't want to face the penalty. Okay? You don't want to face the penalty. Whatever that penalty could be, it might be something insignificant. And that may be good enough for someone who's not a Christian. You don't want to get in trouble. That's not good enough for a Christian. The second reason is for conscience's sake. For conscience's sake. You do not want to break civil law because you're a Christian. If you break civil law, you're violating God's law. As long as it does not violate God's law. For instance, and this is one that I have to watch myself all the time. If the speed limit is 55, does that contradict God's law in any way? If the state says do not speed, that has got nothing to do with God's law, does it? So if I speed and I'm breaking God's law or the state's law, God upholds that law. I'm supposed to abide by that. So I have to abide by it. And as bad as I hate it, if I break that law, that's breaking God's law. So I can't be out here habitually breaking God's law. I need to think about that. I need to consider that. Okay? So that's the two reasons in verse 5. I can't violate my conscience. I'm supposed to, and I'm required, we're going to notice in the next chapter, to maintain a pure conscience. Romans 14:23. And because of the truths just presented, all of those things that Paul talked about, the things the government does, the government's there to make our lives peaceable, the government's there to protect us, on and on, verses 6 through 7. Because of all those things, we are to pay our taxes. That hurt a lot. There are no free rides. There are no free rides. Someone's paying for it. Someone's paying for it. Our protection as a nation, someone's paying for that. Our protection as the city of East Ridge, somebody's paying for that. Whatever, keeping the lights on for the street lights, so we can drive or walk on the sidewalk. Somebody's paying for that. You name it, whatever keeps the government rolling, somebody's paying for it. And guess who that somebody is? We're sitting here. Right? We're sitting here. And so we have to pay our taxes. Does paying our taxes violate God's laws? No. In fact, if we don't pay our taxes, that violates God's laws. You pay tribute to who tribute is due. We have no control over how the government spends our tax money. All we have control over is that we pay it. They will answer for improper stewardship. We have to keep that in mind. Any comments? All right. Huh? Oh, well, we do have say in our voting, and I always recommend to Christians to vote. You know, let's vote. Let's try to vote. You know, how we believe God probably wants us to vote, or according to His law. But I think you're right. Participate. You know, let's participate in our government if we can. I think God wants us to do that. The Jehovah's Witnesses don't believe that. They don't believe that. Yeah, Jesus did talk about that. Talk about the money, and it had Caesar's picture on it. Yeah. All right, fulfilling the law through love, verses 8 through 10. This has been misused a lot, verse 8. Owe nobody anything but love. This has been used a lot to say, well, look, there you go, a Christian can't incur debt. You can't go borrow money. Well, that's not true. That's not the subject. That's not the subject here. Going and borrow money to buy a home or to buy a car or something like that, that's not the subject. In the context of this verse is the instruction and the requirement for Christians to pay their taxes. But the rest of this sets the context for our continuing debt to others. That's the idea. Our continuing debt is that we love one another. Okay, that's the idea. Okay, he's just using that as a segue. We're not to allow that debt to go unpaid. Okay, and Paul talked about that earlier, didn't he? I'm debtor both to the Jew and to the Greek. He owes that debt of love. Okay, and the one who shows love has fulfilled the law, because God requires that Christians love each other. And he listed 5 prohibitions that show genuine love. If you have genuine love, you're not going to do any one of these toward another person. And these 5 prohibitions just happen so to be the last 5 prohibitions found in the Decalogue. Okay? Found in the last 5 of the 10 Commandments. Those principles have been brought over and taught in the New Testament. You can't show love for your neighbor if you steal, or you're murdering, or you covet his things, or you lie, or things of that nature. So, and he summarizes the point by saying, love worketh no ill to his neighbor. Okay. Stated positively, we seek what's best for our neighbor. Wouldn't that be great to have a neighbor who always was looking out for your best interest? I live in a great neighborhood. I live in a cove, and the neighbors around me, we all get along really great, and we all look out for one another, and it's just you couldn't ask for a better situation. It's a wonderful neighborhood right there, and probably the best neighborhood I've ever lived in. But if we love like we ought, we're not going to wish any harm. We're not going to do any harm. We're not going to actively seek out wrong for anyone. That's how you love someone, right? But that's not our whole duty to God, to love our neighbor. We have to love God himself with all our being. And that includes obedience. So, in view of eternity, how should we live? We ought to live a holy life, because there's more than just living in this physical world and being obedient to the civil government. That's just part of it. Okay? And Paul, in verse 11, he talks about being very aware of the swiftness of time. It's just clicking right away. Listen, anyone who's lived any amount of time, okay, we understand that it just seems like yesterday our children were being brought home from the hospital. You're holding them on one hand, one arm. I used to take Taylor. She went to kindergarten in public school when she was 6, and I carried Cameron, was just a baby, on one arm like a football. And I was screaming after Alexander because she was a heathen. She's running around. I couldn't even catch her. But I had Cameron on one arm. And those teachers used to say, "You're going to drop that baby." I said, "This is my 3rd one. What do you mean I'm going to drop her?" And I used to make fun of people. They said, "Well, it just seems like yesterday." And I was like, "There's no way. What do you mean seems like yesterday? That kid's 40. I think that in my mind now. That person's 40. I'll never live to be 40. Well, I've way passed that up. And it just seems like it was yesterday. And Paul's saying it's swift. We're closer right now to salvation. That's what he's telling these folks. The ones he wrote to, you're closer to salvation. He's talking about heaven, right? He's not talking about initial salvation of obeying the gospel. He's talking about heaven. You're closer to leaving this world and going to heaven if you remain faithful than you've ever been. That applies to us. We're closer to leaving this world right now than we've ever been. Now, it may be another 100 years. We may live to be 300. I don't know. But we're closer right now than we've ever been. And so what does he want them to do? Well, wake up. Do something, right? Wake up. And because of that, because time is so fast, he wants them to understand a little something about what's going on here. Stay focused. Stay focused. Right? Stay focused on what you're doing, because it'll be here before you know it. It'll be here before you know it. And live an honest life before all people. Live like God wants you to live. Any comments, questions? All right. Let's move into chapter 14. Chapter 14 is a very important chapter. it's one of my favorite chapters to study in the book of Romans. One reason is because it's been, I feel like it's been misused over the years. And people who hope to use it to support their false notions about different things, this isn't their chapter. Okay? They've tried to do that, but this isn't their chapter. It is not a chapter that treats with indifference the false idea of mechanical instruments of music or the missionary society. It doesn't do that. It's not a chapter that justifies the social drinking in his bad habit. Okay? It's been used for that. It's not the chapter that is going to teach the infallibility of the human conscience. If you feel like you can do it, then it's okay. This is not their chapter for that either. Because if it was, it would contradict everything else in the Bible. What this chapter is a chapter based solely on scruples. That's not a word you're going to find in the Bible. A scruple is a matter of opinion, but it goes beyond a matter of opinion. It's a matter of opinion that is based in something that has been said in Scripture. Okay? It's not like what color is the carpet or the walls. This is something based in Scripture. It is a matter of indifference, but it is based in Scripture. It is something that may or may not violate your conscience. It is something that is in and of itself not wrong, but you can make it wrong. And so you have to listen to your conscience on the matter. Okay? Brother Woods said it was Paul's purpose in our lesson text to show that all such, talking about these scruples, were in the realm of opinion, and the brethren should exhibit tolerance, patience, kindness, and forbearance. Now, there are 7 basic ideas revealed in chapter 14. Paul writes to those who are weak in the faith, and he admonishes the brethren to receive them, yet not for the sake of scruples. There are 2 specific contextual areas that are spoken about: eating meat and observing special days. Then he talks about judging one over the position he takes on these matters is forbidden. You can't judge a person if he chooses to, or you can't judge a person if he chooses not to. Brotherly love is commanded. Occasionally, you're going to have to allow your love to give in to your brother, okay, when it's a scruple. We must be confident and maintain a clear conscience if we hold a scruple. We may never violate our conscience. We may or may not be talked into or out of a scruple. Period. That does not mean we cannot learn our way out of a scruple, meaning that we might be able to change our mind at some point. But I can't talk Brother Bill into or out of a scruple, and he can't me. Paul has written on similar subjects in different letters. But it's not the similarity that we're going to be concerned with. When he wrote to the brethren in Galatia and Colossae, he was very aggressive in that. In this letter, he's not aggressive at all. The difference is he was dealing with Judaizing teachers who were trying to pervert the gospel. In Galatia and Colossae, here he's dealing with people who were just observing a scruple, which was their right. There's no evidence that anyone was trying to observe the Colossae heresy or trying to teach a false doctrine. They were just observing a scruple, and he's trying to explain what the deal is about scruples. There's a few things we need to remember in this chapter. The admonitions for tolerance for the weak brother do not apply when standing against error. He's not talking about error in any shape, form, at all. Not talking about standing against error. He's talking about a matter of indifference, a scruple. Nothing he refers to is of a doctrinal nature. And what I mean, a matter of salvation. Okay? Not one thing, unless the person holding the opinion tries to bind it on someone else. What makes the weak brother weak? Okay? It isn't that he's weak in the faith, or he doesn't have a knowledge, or he's less. The weak brother has to do with his conscience. He has, quote, a weaker conscience. He has a softer conscience. His conscience is more easily pricked. Okay? Something bothers his conscience more. The weaker brother is the person who holds the scruple. Okay? Put that in your notes. It's not in your notes. The weaker brother holds the scruple. The stronger brother does not hold the scruple. He can take it or leave it. He understands that it doesn't mean anything. Okay? What does offended mean? Offended does not mean what we think offended means in our modern sense. Offended here means to cause to stumble. Okay? If I'm eating meat in front of Bill, who does not eat the meat, okay, because say it's been offered to an idol, he comes out of a pagan religion, and he feels like if he eats the meat, he's recognizing that idol is a god. So he can't eat the meat. Well, that idol's nothing. I can eat the meat all day long. Doesn't mean anything to me. But if I eat the meat in front of Bill, I might in some way encourage him to eat it and violate his conscience. Because if he ate it, it would violate his conscience. Now that doesn't mean at some point later on in his life, the more he studies and the more he grows, eventually he comes to understand, like Paul does, that idol's not anything. They can offer 20,000 sacrifices to that idol. Doesn't mean anything. That doesn't make that meat any different. I'll go down, buy the meat, I'll eat it. No big deal. But right now, that'll violate his conscience. So that's what it means, don't offend him. Okay? Any questions? Okay. Verses 1 through 8. Some are weak in the faith. Paul uses the word faith here. Now this is the one time, or one of the times, he's not talking about the system of faith. He's not talking about our personal faith. He's talking about someone who is unsure about certain things. Okay? Now, in the first 4 verses, he's talking about eating meat. And that's the idea. You come across some meat. You know you went down to the market because that's what they would do. They're in Rome. There's all kinds of temples and pagan religions, and they offer a sacrifice in one of the temples. Well, they offer that animal. Well, what do they do with the meat? They take it down to the market and they sell it. Okay? Someone comes along and they say, okay, I'll take that side of whatever. Well, a new Gentile, a new Christian Gentile comes through, and he says, I can't eat that because it's part of that worship exercise. Well, the Jew comes through. He said, no problem to him. He recognizes God is God. These idols don't mean anything. He'll buy it and he'll eat it. Well, Paul says, again, the example I just used, don't eat it in front of them. Take it home and eat it. Eat your meat at home. Or, don't ask where the meat came from. Because if you ask where the meat came from, then you won't be able to buy it and you won't be able to eat it. Just say nothing. Don't ask questions. Just eat the meat. Or don't eat the meat. Either way is fine. But here's something else about a scruple. If the Jew says, I'm going to eat it, or the Jew just buys it and says nothing, and the Gentile sees him buy it in the market, he's going to take it home, and the Gentile says, hey, wait a minute, buddy. Come here, brother. I'm going to talk to you about something. Do you know where that meat came from? The Jewish Christian says, yeah, I just bought it at the market. Yeah, but I saw that they just brought that from the temple. They offered that in a worship to that idol down there. You can't eat that. Well, you don't have a right to tell him he can't eat that. This is a scruple. Keep that to yourself. You don't have a right to tell him he can't eat it. Just as the Jew doesn't have to say, well, you're wrong for not eating it. Come on over and we'll have a barbecue. You got to keep all that to yourself. That's how scruples work. So that's why Paul said, receive the weak brother, the one who had a fragile conscience, but it's not a matter of fellowship. Just don't engage with them. It's a matter of principle or conscience. Just don't try to make them do something. A scruple could also be using one cup at the Lord's Supper. A scruple could be having a Christmas tree. As long as I don't do it as a religious holiday, I can have a Christmas tree every year. That's a civil holiday, a secular holiday. Now, I don't want to one cup it. If I go in somewhere and it's one cup, I want to be the first guy, right? Everybody behind me can, they're too bad for you. But it's okay to drink out of one cup. Years ago, every congregation was one cup because that's all they had was one cup. But my granny dipped snuff, and she had that amber running down her chin like this, and she'd take that drink. I don't know. Thank you. We had a guy in Crossville come in, and he worshiped with us, and he said, do y'all have a congregation right here that has one cup? I said, yeah, across town. He said, okay, thank you. But he didn't bind that on anyone. If they want one cup, no problem. When we can cooperate with each other, but as long as they say it's not a matter of fellowship, that's okay. Eating in a church building. If you don't want to eat in a church building, that's okay as long as you don't bind it. We had a lady in Memphis. She would not eat with us in the fellowship hall. But she worshiped with us. She didn't bind it. But that was her background. Excuse me. And she couldn't move past it. But it hurt her conscience, but she didn't tell us we were wrong. That's how you handle a scruple. He did the same thing here with days, certain days. Again, Christmas. You don't have to observe Christmas. I knew a Catholic couple that would not observe Christmas because they came out of the Catholic Church. That's a big deal for them. They felt like they were observing a Catholic holiday. They didn't observe Christmas, no problem. But don't try to bind it on anyone. As long as we're not adding a holy day to God's calendar, we can observe any day over any other day that we want to. My dad used to kill him if I worked in between services. And just simply because he was my dad, we had a relationship, obviously, that we could say whatever we wanted to each other. And he'd say, man, I wish you'd stop doing that. I'd say, why? He said, well, you're just not supposed to be working on Sunday. I said, Dad, you can work any day of the week you want to. He said, yeah, I know, but I just wish you wouldn't do that. He would never say that to anybody else. But that was just his thing. He wouldn't do it, but I'm the only person he'd say, don't work on Sunday. I'd say, I'll see you at evening service. I'm going to work. I'll be right back. Anybody else is their business. Any comments? Well, verses 9 through 12, we all have to stand before God. To that end. To what end? To the end we live for God, not unto ourselves. Right? Jesus came to purchase people for God's own possession. He lived, He died. Therefore it is God to whom we ultimately answer. And we ought to really think about that, right? And that ought to remind us, if we're going to stand in judgment before God, our judgments about these matters of opinion, we ought to be able to easily set those things aside and not even be bothered by them. I used to hold a scruple when Paul said widows are to marry only in the Lord. What in the world would that mean? Widows? That's what I thought. That's what I thought, and I did it for the longest. But if that's true, that would be a sin if you married someone who was a non-Christian. So now you got two laws, someone for a widow and someone for a virgin, right? If it's wrong for a widow to marry someone who's not a Christian, it had to be wrong for a virgin to do it, because that'd be a respecter of persons. And then you'd have to get out of that marriage, and you can't divorce someone just because they're not a Christian, right? And finally I just kept talking to myself about it, and I was like, that can't be right. So it must mean you have to marry according to God's law. And then I thought about this. I said, children, obey your parents in the Lord. Are children supposed to obey their parents if they're not Christians, if their parents are not Christians? Well, 100%. 100%. I was a Christian before my daddy ever was. And I was still living at home. You know what he'd have done to me if I rolled in one day and I said, hey, Daddy, you're not a Christian. I'm running the show now. Yeah, I'd have been no more. I'd have been no more. So, you widows marry in the Lord. They marry according to God's law. Now, having said that, that can be a scruple. That could be a scruple. So, if a widow or a widower finds himself in a position, obviously your widow or widower, your wife or your husband has passed on, it would violate their conscience if they were to marry someone who wasn't a Christian. That is a prime example of a scruple. I personally held that for a long time. I changed my mind on it. I grew out of it. But when we look at the judgments of chapter 14, we can't be making judgments on someone's scruple, because Paul told us to keep our scruples to ourselves. We might not agree with it, but it's not our business. As long as a person does not bind it or, something of that nature. So when we think of judgment and we're going to stand in front of God and answer to Him, it makes our petty judgments kind of look small, doesn't it? And plus, our judgments are supposed to be righteous judgments. So let's kind of review this up to this point before we finish up here. We just got about a few minutes left here to finish this chapter. Who is the weak brother? The weak brother is not someone who is less. He is the one who holds the scruple, the matter of faith, okay? And he is overly strict about it. That's just the way it is. That's fine. That's fine, but he can't bind it, okay? But he can't be condemned for it either. He just has to keep it to himself. I can't try to talk him out of it. That doesn't mean he can't change his mind. The strong brother is the one who doesn't make it a matter of faith. He can eat the meat. He can have a Christmas tree. He can drink out of he can have multiple cups on the Lord's table. He can have the little bitty crackers already, where you don't have to break it off. A myriad of things. He can eat in the church building. Those things aren't matters of faith. But whatever we do, whatever it is, it can't violate our conscience. It cannot violate our conscience, okay? Because then you've turned something that is a matter of opinion into a sin. Okay, now you've turned it into a sin. He says, don't cause another to stumble through verse 23. There are two senses in which the word judge is used in verse 13. The first one is you place motive on a person's actions. In the second one, the word judge is used to determine something. Okay? So, Paul might say, stop judging someone, but determine that you will not put a stumbling block in front of them. Don't act like you're reading their heart. Just don't cause them to stumble. That's the idea here. Okay? And also, he's not talking in this passage or saying that nothing is unclean. Obviously, there are things that are unclean in the world that are sinful. He's simply talking about eating meat here. There are no unclean meats. So he's specifically stating that. You can eat whatever you want to eat. Okay, that's the idea. So the statement has to be limited to that. But it still could violate your conscience. To the person, it still could be unclean. So, in other words, Peter, who had a problem in chapter 10, if he maintained that problem, he still might not could eat something that was deemed unclean under the Old Testament. Now, I don't think he did. I'm just using that as an example. Now, here's something else. The weak brother is not permitted to take advantage of other people because of his scruple. Okay? Well, I don't want to eat in the church building, so therefore nobody can eat in the church building. In other words, we can't bind that scruple. You have to, go home for lunch or whatever. You just can't do that. And so here's the principle that Paul gives here. The good that he's talking about, some people think it's the gospel. I think what he's talking about here is the Christian liberty. We've been set free, and they were to preach that liberty, and we are to encourage others into that liberty, but we cannot use our liberty to do these things to cause someone who has a stricter conscience to stumble, because that would give our enemies an opportunity to speak evil of our liberty. Because here's the thing, brethren, Jesus didn't come to earth, live, die, establish a church so we could eat whatever we want to eat, or have a Christmas tree, or argue with our brethren about drinking out of one cup, or all these things are silly if we make a big deal about it. I'm not saying it's silly if it violates your conscience. What I'm saying is it's silly if we cause a problem over it. In fact, Paul said in one of the previous verses, you're not to argue over things that you're not sure about. Not to have argument over it. Don't fuss about it. Keep quiet about it. Okay? And in these last verses, people like to use this as their go-to verse for social drinking, but wine here is a generic term, and it can't be used can't apply to social drinking. Okay? And we just can't parade our rights in front of the weak brethren. Again, can't cause them to stumble. If it bothers them, and this is the example, if it bothers them that you're eating meat, don't get right in their face and do it. If it bothers your brother that you observe Christmas or you have a Christmas tree, you don't get right in front of them and start talking about how you decorated it. That's not necessary. But again, they can't, if I'm over here talking to Reggie about us decorating lights on our houses, and the weak brother who's opposed to that just happens to walk up in our conversation, he can't expect us just to stop what we're doing just because he walked up. Okay? We may, just out of kindness to him, because we want to, show preference to him, we may stop. But he's still, at the same time, not permitted to take advantage of his scruple. Okay? Any comments or questions regarding scruples? Yeah. Yeah, we're going to put one up in the foyer, right? But so anyway, that's the idea on that. All right, brethren, thank you so much, and it's right on time. Appreciate you.